Jake Morrison sat in his small office at Chicago University, drinking his third cup of coffee that morning. The math papers on his desk were covered with red ink marks from grading student tests. Most of his students had failed the basic algebra. Exam again. He rubbed his tired eyes and wondered if he was a good teacher. The phone rang. Jake picked it up without looking away from the papers. "Hello, Professor Morrison speaking. Good sir, this is Director Williams from the Earth Science Council. We need to talk to you right away." Good put down his coffee cup. The Earth Science Council. Never called small university professors like him. "Is there a problem?" "Not a problem, Professor. An opportunity. Can you come to Washington today?" 3 hours later, Jake sat in a huge conference room filled with important-looking people in expensive suits. Director Williams, a tall woman with gray hair, stood at the front of the room next to a large screen. "Gentlemen and ladies, we have received an invitation from the Galactic Education Council. They want to test human intelligence." The screen showed a message written in strange symbols that hurt Jake's eyes to look at. Below the symbols was text in English. "To the species known as humans, your planet has been observed for 50 Earth years. We invite one representative to participate in the Universal Cognitive Assessment. This test has been given for 300 years. Only the most advanced minds in the galaxy attempt it. Many who try are damaged permanently. Choose your representative carefully." Jake felt his stomach drop. The other people in the room were talking excitedly, but their voices sounded far away. Director Williams continued, "We need to pick someone to represent all of humanity. Someone smart enough to not embarrass our entire species." Dr. Peterson, a famous scientist from Harvard, raised his hand. "What exactly is this test?" "We don't know much. The aliens call it the hardest math problem in the galaxy. They say it tests the limits of what any mind can understand. Some species have never had anyone even attempt it. Every person there was more famous and smarter than him. Dr. Peterson had won 3 Nobel Prizes. Dr. Chang had written books that Jake had studied in graduate school. Dr. Roberts had solved math problems that most people couldn't even understand. "How do we choose?" asked Dr. Chang. Director Williams looked uncomfortable. "The aliens were very specific. They want us to pick randomly from a list of qualified candidates. They say this prevents species from sending only their absolute best minds." Jake's hands started to sweat. What makes someone qualified? A doctorate? In mathematics and at least 10 years of teaching experience, Jake had both of those things. He'd gotten his math doctorate from a good school, and he'd been teaching for 12 years. But he wasn't special like the other people in this room. "Director?" Williams pulled out a black box. "We have 47 qualified candidates. All of your names are in here." The room got very quiet. Jake could hear his heart beating. "The test takes place in 2 weeks on a space station near Mars. Whoever gets picked will represent all of humanity. The aliens will judge our entire species based on how well this person does." Dr. Peterson cleared his throat. "What happens if the person fails?" "We don't know. But the message mentioned permanent damage. Some minds can't handle the stress of the problem." Jake thought about his small apartment, his simple life, his students who struggled with basic math. He thought about the other brilliant people in this room. Any of them would be better than him. Director Williams reached into the black box and pulled out a small piece of paper. She opened it slowly. "Jake Morrison." The room went silent. Everyone turned to look at Jake. He felt like he might throw up. "There must be a mistake," he said quietly. "No mistake, Professor. You're our representative." Dr. Peterson stood up. "With respect, Director Williams, this is too important. Dr. Morrison is a good teacher, but this test requires someone with more experience in advanced mathematics." Jake felt his face turn red. Dr. Peterson was right. Jake taught basic courses to undergraduate students. He hadn't done serious mathematical research in years. "The choice is made," Director Williams said firmly. "The aliens were very clear about the random selection process. We cannot change it." Over the next hour, they explained what would happen. Jake would travel to the space station in 10 days. He would have access to any books or materials he wanted. To study, the test would take 4 hours. Representatives from dozens of alien species would be there. "What do I study?" Jake asked. "What kind of math will it be?" Dr. Chang looked sorry for him. "We don't know. The aliens haven't told us anything about the specific content. It could be anything." Jake spent the next week trying to study everything. He read books about physics that made his head hurt, tried to understand theories that seemed impossible. He worked 18 hours a day, drinking coffee and taking notes until his hands cramped. His students noticed he was distracted. During his last class before leaving for the space station, a student asked if he was okay. "I'm fine," Jake lied. "Just tired." After class, he sat alone in his office. On his desk was the newspaper open to the daily Sudoku puzzle. He had been doing the same puzzle every morning for 5 years. It was a simple habit that helped him wake up. Without thinking, he picked up his pen and started solving it. The familiar pattern was comforting. Filled in the numbers methodically, using logic to figure out where each one belonged. Within 10 minutes, the puzzle was complete. Jake stared at the finished Sudoku. It was probably the last normal thing he would do before leaving Earth. Soon he would be sitting in a room with alien beings, trying to solve a math problem that had destroyed other minds. He thought about his students, who would probably never know what happened to their teacher. He thought about his small apartment, his simple life, his ordinary existence. None of it had prepared him for this moment. The next morning, Jake packed a small bag with his clothes and a few personal items. He put his favorite pen in his pocket, the same pen he used for grading papers and solving Sudoku puzzles. He didn't know why, but having it with him felt important at the Space Center. Director Williams met him before he boarded the shuttle. "Remember, Professor, you're representing all of humanity. Do your best." Jake nodded, but he didn't feel ready. As the shuttle lifted off from Earth, he looked down at the planet getting smaller below him. Somewhere down there, people were living their normal lives, not knowing that their species was about to be judged by how well one ordinary math teacher could solve an impossible problem. The journey to the space station took 2 days. Jake spent most of the time reading and trying not to think about what would happen when he arrived. But late at night, when he couldn't sleep, he would pull out a book of Sudoku puzzles and work through them quietly. The simple logic was the only thing that calmed his mind. As the space station came into view, Jake saw ships from dozens of different worlds docked around it. Each ship looked completely different, built by alien minds with alien technology. Soon he would meet the beings who had built those ships, and they would all be watching him fail. Jake took a deep breath and prepared to represent humanity in the most important test any human had ever taken. Jake stepped off the shuttle and into the space station. The corridor was huge, with walls that seemed to be made of some kind of glowing metal. Strange sounds echoed from different directions. He had never felt so small in his life. A robot guided him to the testing area. As they walked, Jake saw other beings through the transparent walls. Some looked almost human, but had blue skin and 4 arms. Others were covered in what looked like crystal scales that sparkled in the light. One group had tentacles instead of arms and moved by floating above the ground. "First time seeing other species?" the robot asked in perfect English. "Yes," Jake replied, trying not to stare at a creature that looked like a walking tree with eyes. Galactic Education Council has representatives from 93 different worlds. Today, 47 species will attempt the Universal Cognitive Assessment. Jake's mouth went dry. 47 different alien species, all probably smarter than humans, all sending their best minds to take this test. The robot stopped at a large door. "This is the preparation area. You have 2 hours before the test begins. Use this time wisely." Jake entered a room filled with the strangest beings he had ever imagined. Near the window, 3 creatures that looked like giant butterflies were making musical sounds to each other. In the corner, beings that seemed to be made of living rock were connecting cables to their heads. Everyone was preparing for the test in their own way. A tall being with 6 arms and glowing eyes approached. Jake, the universal translator on Jake's collar, turned its words into English. You are the human representative. Yes, I'm Jake Morrison. I am Examiner Keth of the Vorthok. We created this test 300 years ago. I'm curious about your preparation methods. Jake looked around the room. Every other being had brought equipment that looked incredibly advanced. Some had floating computers. Others had devices that projected mathematical equations into the air. Few were taking pills that made their eyes glow brighter. I don't have any equipment, Jake said honestly. Examiner Keth's 6 arms moved in what might have been surprise. No cognitive enhancers, no quantum calculators, no neural boosters. Jake pulled out his simple pen and a notepad. Just these. The examiner stared at Jake's basic supplies. Other beings nearby stopped their preparations to look. Ow. Jake heard what? Sounded like laughter from some of them. Perhaps your species does not understand the difficulty of this assessment, Examiner Keth said. The problem requires calculations that would challenge the most powerful computers. It involves mathematics that exist in 17 different dimensional frameworks. Jake nodded, though he didn't really understand what that meant. I'll do my best. The test has permanently damaged minds that attempted it without proper preparation. Are you certain you wish to continue? Jake thought about Earth, about his students, about Director Williams telling him he represented all of humanity. I'm certain. The examiner moved away, shaking what Jake assumed was its head. Jake found an empty corner and sat down. While other beings used their advanced equipment, he closed his eyes and tried to stay calm. He thought about his morning routine back on Earth. Coffee, newspaper, Sudoku puzzle. The simple logic of the puzzle had always helped him think clearly. He wondered if that would help him now. A loud sound filled the room. All candidates, please enter the testing chamber. Jake followed the group into an enormous circular room. 47 chairs were arranged in a circle, each one designed for a different type of body. Jake found the chair marked human and sat down. It was surprisingly comfortable. In the center of the room, a massive holographic display appeared. Mathematical symbols floated in the air, some of them moving and changing color. Jake had never seen anything like it. Examiner Keth's voice filled. The room candidates, you will now see the universal cognitive assessment. You have exactly 4 hours to solve this problem. Begin when you are ready. The symbols in the center suddenly expanded, and a copy of the problem appeared in front of each candidate. Jake stared at the floating equations that now surrounded him. The mathematics were unlike anything he had ever seen. Strange symbols connected to numbers that seemed to exist in multiple dimensions at once. Some parts of the equation were moving, changing as he watched. Around him, the other candidates immediately began working. Ow! The butterfly creatures started making complex musical patterns. The rock beings connected more cables to their heads. The blue-skinned four-armed beings began typing on keyboards that appeared in the air. Jake just sat and stared at the problem. He couldn't understand most of the symbols. The mathematical concepts were far beyond anything he had learned in school. This was clearly designed for minds much more advanced than his. For the first 20 minutes, Jake didn't write anything. He just looked at the massive equation floating in front of him. Other candidates were already deep into their calculations, using technology and methods he couldn't comprehend. Then something strange happened. Jake stopped trying to understand the individual symbols and started looking at the overall shape of the problem. He ignored the complicated mathematics and focused on how different parts of the equation related to each other. The structure reminded him of something familiar. There were sections that seemed to depend on other sections. Some parts had to be solved before others could be attempted. Certain elements appeared to have fixed relationships with each other. Jake pulled out his pen and paper. Instead of trying to calculate the alien mathematics, he started drawing a simple diagram. He drew boxes to represent different parts of the problem. He drew lines to show how the parts connected to each other. As he worked, the pattern became clearer. The problem, despite all its complexity and strange symbols, was organized like a logic puzzle. Just like the Sudoku puzzles he solved every morning. This problem had rules that governed how the pieces fit together. Jake began to smile. He couldn't calculate the exact values of the alien mathematics, but he could see the logical relationships. If this section had to equal that section, and if these elements had to balance with those elements, then certain parts of the solution were already determined by the structure itself. He started filling in his diagram with simple numbers and letters, treating the complex alien symbols as basic variables in a logic puzzle. Where the mathematics became too complicated, he simply noted that variable A had to relate to variable B in a specific way. Examiner Keth had been walking around the room, observing each candidate's approach. When he reached Jake, he stopped and stared. The human wasn't using any advanced mathematics. It wasn't even trying to understand the alien symbols. Instead, he was treating the universal cognitive assessment like some kind of simple puzzle. Other candidates noticed the examiner's attention on Jake. A few of them looked over at the human's work. Jake could sense their confusion. He was clearly not approaching the problem the way everyone else was. Jake continued working methodically. He had divided the massive equation into smaller sections, just like the boxes in a Sudoku puzzle. Each section, he identified what values were possible based on the logical constraints. Then he used the process of elimination to narrow down the possibilities, where other candidates were calculating the exact speed of theoretical particles traveling through imaginary dimensions. Jake simply noted that whatever that speed was, it had to be consistent with the other parts of the problem. He didn't need to know the precise mathematical value. He only needed to understand how it fit into the overall pattern. 2 hours into the test, Jake was making steady progress. His simple diagram was filling up with logical deductions. Many of the other candidates were showing signs of stress. Some were holding their heads in their hands. Others had stopped working entirely and were staring at the problem with what looked like despair. Jake felt calm. This was just like solving a really big Sudoku puzzle. The symbols were strange and the context was intimidating, but the underlying logic was the same. Each piece had to fit with every other piece according to specific rules. As the third hour began, Jake realized something amazing. The solution was starting to reveal itself, not through complex calculations, but through simple, logical deduction. The pattern was becoming clear, and once he could see the pattern, the answer was almost obvious. He looked around the room at the other candidates struggling with their advanced equipment and complicated theories. They were all trying to calculate their way through the problem. Jake was simply reasoning his way through it. One logical step at a time, the examiner was still watching him, and Jake could sense the alien's confusion and growing interest. The human was solving the universal cognitive assessment like it was a newspaper puzzle, and somehow it was working. Jake was halfway through the third hour when things started going wrong for the other candidates. The butterfly creatures had stopped making their musical sounds and were now making high-pitched noises that sounded like screaming. 2 of the rock beings had disconnected their cables and were sitting motionless, their eyes dim. Examiner Keth moved quickly between the candidates, checking on those who seemed to be in distress. A floating stretcher appeared and carried away one of the tentacled beings who had collapsed entirely. The creature's tentacles were twitching, and it was making sounds that the translator couldn't convert into words. Jake looked up from his paper, concerned. Are they okay? The cognitive strain is too much for some minds, Examiner Keth explained. This is why we warn species about the dangers of this assessment. The problem is designed to push mental capabilities beyond normal limits. Jake felt guilty. While these advanced beings were suffering, he was sitting calmly with his pen and paper, feeling like he was just doing a morning puzzle. Maybe he wasn't taking this seriously enough. Maybe he didn't understand how hard this was supposed to be. He looked back at his diagram. The pattern was becoming clearer with each logical step. He had filled in about 60% of his chart. Using simple deduction, each answer led to the next answer, just like in Sudoku, where placing one number correctly opens up possibilities for other numbers. Another candidate was removed from the room, this one from a species that looked like walking plants. Their leaves had turned brown, and they were shaking uncontrollably. Only 31 candidates remained out of the original 47. Jake tried to focus on his work, but he kept getting distracted by the suffering around him. These beings had brought the most advanced technology in the galaxy. They had prepared for months, or maybe years. Their entire species had probably worked together to select their best minds, and they were failing. Meanwhile, Jake was using a 20-cent pen and a notepad he had bought at a drugstore on Earth. Examiner Keth approached Jake again. The alien's 6 arms were moving in what Jake was starting to recognize as agitation. Human. I must ask again, are you experiencing any mental strain? Any confusion or disorientation? No, sir, looked up from his paper. No, sir, I'm doing fine. You understand that 17 candidates have already been removed due to cognitive overload? I saw that. I'm sorry they're having trouble. Examiner Keth stared at Jake's simple diagram. Show me your approach. Jake turned his paper so the examiner could see it. Well, I noticed that the problem has a structure. See, if this part here has to equal this part over there, then these middle sections are limited in what they can be. The examiner's glowing. Eyes grew brighter. Continue. It's like a logic puzzle. You don't need to calculate every single value. You just need to understand how the pieces fit together. Once you see the pattern, you can eliminate the impossible answers and find the right ones. Jake pointed to different parts of his diagram. For example, this section here can only be one of 3 possible values. But if it's the first value, then this other section becomes impossible. If it's the second value, then this third section doesn't work. So it has to be the third value. Examiner Keth was silent for a long moment. Jake worried that he had said something wrong. You are treating the universal cognitive assessment as a logic puzzle? Well, yes, isn't it? The examiner's arms moved in what Jake was beginning to think might be the alien equivalent of shock. Around them, more candidates were showing signs of distress. The blue-skinned 4-armed beings were holding their heads and making low moaning sounds. Their floating keyboards had disappeared, and they were no longer working on the problem. Human, this assessment was designed to test the absolute limits of mathematical cognition. It requires calculations that should be impossible for biological minds. It incorporates 17 different dimensional frameworks and quantum mechanical principles that most species cannot even comprehend. Jake nodded politely. It looks very complicated. But underneath all that, it's still just a logic puzzle. He went back to his work, not noticing that Examiner Keth had gone completely still. The alien was staring at Jake's diagram with what might have been disbelief. Jake continued filling in his chart. It developed a rhythm now. Look at a section. Identify the constraints. Eliminate the impossible options. Deduce the correct answer. Move to the next section. It was peaceful and methodical, like his morning routine with coffee and Stodo. With 1 hour remaining, Jake realized he was close to finishing. His diagram was almost complete. The pattern of the entire problem was now clear to him. The solution wasn't just a collection of numbers and symbols. It was an elegant design, like a completed puzzle where every piece fit perfectly with every other piece. He started double-checking his work, going back through his logical steps to make sure he hadn't made any mistakes. This was another habit from his Sudoku solving. Always verify your answer before calling it finished. As Jake worked, he became aware that the room had grown much quieter. He looked up and saw that only 12 candidates remained. The others had either been removed due to mental strain or had given up and were sitting with their heads in their hands. The remaining candidates were all staring at Jake. Some looked confused. Others appeared almost angry. The human was sitting calmly with his simple pen and paper, apparently unaffected by a problem that had broken the minds of some of the galaxy's most advanced beings. Jake felt embarrassed by all the attention. Sorry, am I being too loud? Nobody answered. They just kept staring. Jake returned to his work. He was now in the verification phase, checking each logical step to make sure his reasoning was sound. This was actually his favorite part of solving puzzles. The satisfaction of seeing how all the pieces fit together perfectly. Examiner Keth had called for additional observers. Noticed that more aliens had entered the room and were watching him work. They were talking quietly among themselves in languages that his translator couldn't handle. With 30 minutes left, Jake completed his final check. His diagram was finished, and every logical step had been verified. He looked at the original problem floating in front of him then, at his simple chart on paper. The complex alien mathematics had been reduced to a clear, logical pattern. Jake began transferring his answers to the official answer sheet, where the problem asked for specific mathematical values. He wrote down the logical relationships he had discovered. Where it required calculations in alien number systems, he explained the pattern that governed those calculations. He worked carefully, making sure his handwriting was neat. Back on Earth, his students sometimes complained that they couldn't read. His writing on the blackboard, he didn't want the same problem here. Other candidates watched in amazement as Jake calmly filled out his answer sheet. The human appeared completely relaxed, occasionally pausing to check his work with the same attention someone might give to filling out a simple form, as Jake neared completion. He noticed something that made him smile. When he looked at his finished diagram, the pattern formed a shape that reminded him of a completed Sudoku grid. The mathematical relationships created a visual design that was not only logically sound, but also beautiful in its symmetry. The Vorthok had created the galaxy's most complex logic puzzle, disguised it with advanced mathematics, and presented it as the ultimate test of intelligence. But underneath all the intimidating symbols and alien concepts, it was still just a puzzle. And Jake had always been good at puzzles. With 15 minutes remaining, Jake completed his answer sheet, set down his pen, and looked around the room. Only 8 candidates were still working, and most of them appeared to be struggling badly. Jake raised his hand. "Excuse me, I think I'm finished." The entire room went silent. Every eye, both human and alien, turned to look at the math teacher from Chicago who had just claimed to solve the impossible problem. Examiner Keth moved toward Jake's desk, with all 6 arms trembling. The other remaining candidates stopped their work and watched. The room was so quiet that Jake could hear the humming of the space station's engines. "You believe you have solved the universal cognitive assessment?" Examiner Keth asked. "Yes, sir. I double-checked everything twice." Jake handed over his answer sheet. The paper looked small and simple compared to all the advanced technology the other candidates had been using. His handwriting was neat and clear, with small diagrams drawn in the margins. Examiner Keth took the paper with what seemed like careful respect. The alien's glowing eyes moved across Jake's work, growing brighter with each line. Examiners appeared in the room, as if they had been called urgently. "This is impossible," one of the new examiners said through Jake's translator. "Check it again," said another. Jake sat quietly while a group of 6 armed aliens huddled around his answer sheet. They were talking rapidly in their own language, pointing at different parts of his work. Sometimes they would look at Jake, then back at the paper, then at each other. The remaining candidates watched this scene with confusion. A few of them had given up entirely and were just sitting in their chairs. Others were still trying to work on the problem, but they kept glancing over at the group of examiners surrounding the human's simple paper. After 20 minutes of discussion, the lead examiner approached Jake again. "Human Morrison, we need you to explain your solution." "Of course, what would you like me to explain?" "Everything. Start from the beginning." Jake pulled out his notepad with the diagram he had drawn. "Well, when I first looked at the problem, I couldn't understand most of the symbols. The mathematics were way beyond anything I learned in school." The examiners nodded. This was exactly what they expected. "So instead of trying to calculate the specific values, I looked at the overall structure. I noticed that different parts of the equation had to relate to each other in specific ways." Okay. Jake pointed to his simple diagram. "I drew this chart to show how the pieces connected. See, this section here depends on that section there. And this part over here limits what these other parts can be." "You treated it as a logic puzzle," Examiner Keth said. "Exactly. It reminded me of the Sudoku puzzles I do every morning. In Sudoku, you don't need to understand complex mathematics. You just need to see how the numbers relate to each other according to the rules." Jake showed them how he had worked through the problem step by step. "For each section, I identified what values were possible based on the logical constraints. Then I used elimination to narrow down the options. Once I figured out one part, it opened up possibilities for other parts." The examiners listened in complete silence. Around them, the few remaining candidates had stopped working entirely and were listening to Jake's explanation. "But the mathematical concepts," one examiner said. "The 17-dimensional frameworks. The quantum mechanical principles. How did you handle those?" Jake shrugged. "I didn't really understand them, so I just treated them as variables in the logic puzzle. I didn't need to know what they meant. Exactly, I only needed to understand how they related to the other parts of the problem. You bypassed the mathematics entirely." "Not bypassed. I just recognized that underneath all the complex math, there was a logical pattern. The math was important for understanding the specific values. But the core solution could be reached through pattern recognition." Examiner Keth's arms were moving in what Jake now recognized as extreme agitation. "Show us your verification process." Jake walked them through how he had double-checked his work. "I went back through each logical step to make sure my reasoning was sound. Then I checked to see if my answers were consistent with each other. In Sudoku, if you make a mistake early on, it shows up later when the numbers don't fit properly." "Your final answer?" Jake pointed to his completed diagram. "The solution forms a pattern, not just mathematically, but visually. See how it creates this symmetrical design? It told me I was probably on the right track." The examiners spent another hour going through Jake's work line by line. They checked his logic against the master solution key. They verified each step of his reasoning. They tested his answers against calculations that required massive computers to perform. Finally, the lead examiner stood up straight and addressed the room. "The human has solved the universal cognitive assessment correctly." The remaining candidates made sounds of disbelief. Jake felt relieved but also confused by all the attention. "Furthermore," the examiner continued, "he has solved it using a method that no species has ever attempted in 300 years of testing." More Vorthok officials were arriving in the room. Jake counted at least 12 of them now, all studying his simple paper and talking excitedly. One of them approached Jake directly. "I am Senior Academic Advisor Zethfer. I helped design this assessment. Can you explain why you approached it as a logic puzzle?" Jake thought for a moment. "Because that's what it is, isn't it? I mean, underneath all the advanced mathematics, it's still just a puzzle where all the pieces have to fit together according to specific rules. But the computational complexity, the advanced theoretical concepts, these were meant to test the limits of cognitive ability." "Maybe," Jake said, "but sometimes the most complicated-looking problems have simple solutions. My students often make basic math much harder than it needs to be because they overthink it." Senior Academic Advisor Zethfer was quiet for a long time. When he spoke again, his voice was different, more thoughtful. "For 3 centuries, we have assumed that this problem could only be solved through advanced computational methods and superior cognitive processing power. We designed it to test the mathematical limits of biological intelligence." "It is a very hard problem," Jake said politely. "I just happen to recognize the pattern." "That is exactly the point, Human Morrison. We never considered that pattern recognition might be a viable approach. We were so focused on computational complexity that we missed the underlying logical structure." Jake looked around the room at all the advanced beings who had struggled with the problem. Maybe different minds just work in different ways. This simple observation seemed to have a profound effect on the aliens in the room. They began talking among themselves in rapid, excited voices. Jake heard fragments that his translator converted into words like paradigm, revolutionary, and cognitive diversity. "Human Morrison," Senior Academic Advisor Zethfer said, "your success has implications that extend far beyond this single test. You have demonstrated that intelligence can take forms we never anticipated." Jake didn't fully understand what that meant, but it sounded important. "Your species approaches problems differently than any we have encountered. Where we saw computational challenges, you saw logical patterns. Where we required advanced technology, you used basic reasoning." The senior advisor gestured toward Jake's simple pen and paper. "You have solved the galaxy's most difficult cognitive assessment using tools that any being on any world could obtain. This suggests that intelligence is not about having the most advanced capabilities, but about approaching problems from the right perspective. Jake nodded, though he still felt like he was missing something important about why everyone was so excited. The Galactic Education Council will need to reconsider everything we thought we knew about intelligence and problem solving. The senior advisor continued, "Your method will need to be studied and understood. Other species will want to learn these pattern recognition techniques." "It's really not that complicated," Jake said. "It's just like doing puzzles." "Exactly," said Senior Academic Advisor Zephyr. "And that simplicity may be the most revolutionary discovery in galactic academic history." Jake looked around the room at all the aliens staring at him with what he interpreted as amazement and respect. He still felt like the same ordinary math teacher from Chicago. But apparently he had accidentally changed how the galaxy thought about intelligence, all because he had treated their impossible tests like a Sunday morning Sudoku puzzle. 3 months after returning to Earth, Jake was back in his small office at Chicago University, grading student papers. The red ink marks were just as frustrating as before, but now he had a different perspective on learning and intelligence. Phone rang constantly these days. Reporters wanted interviews. Scientists wanted to study his methods. The university had given him a bigger office, but Jake preferred his old cramped space. It felt more comfortable. "Professor Morrison, there's another delegation here to see you," his assistant said through the intercom. Jake sighed and put down his grading pen. This was the 4th alien delegation this week. Ever since news of his solution had spread throughout the galaxy, beings from dozens of worlds had come to Earth to learn about human pattern recognition methods. The delegation consisted of 3 beings from a species called the Aldorians. They looked like tall, thin humans, but with silver skin and large black eyes. Through their translators, they explained that they represented the Aldorian Academy of Sciences. "Professor Morrison, our greatest mathematicians have studied your solution for 2 months. We cannot understand how you recognize the pattern so quickly." Jake offered them chairs, though he wasn't sure if their anatomy worked the same way as humans. "It wasn't really that quick. The pattern just reminded me of something familiar." "The Sudoku puzzles," one of the Aldorians said. "We have obtained thousands of these puzzles from your planet. Our mathematicians have been studying them. Any luck?" "They are incredibly difficult for us. What you call basic logic seems to require tremendous cognitive effort from our minds. We can solve them, but it takes hours of intense concentration." Jake found this fascinating. These beings could probably calculate the orbit of planets in their heads, but they struggled with simple number puzzles. "Maybe our brains just work differently," Jake suggested. That is exactly what we are beginning to understand," the lead Aldorian said. "Intelligence is not a single quality that can be measured uniformly across all species. Different minds have different strengths." Over the following weeks, Jake received visits from many other species. The Crystalline Collective wanted to understand how humans could see patterns without using computational aids. The hive minds of the Outer Rim were puzzled by individual problem-solving techniques. The Machine Intelligence Network was studying how biological brains could outperform their advanced computers in certain types of reasoning. Each species brought their own perspective on intelligence and learning. Jake began to realize that his simple approach to the galactic test had opened up new ways of thinking about how minds work. The Galactic Education Council formally invited Jake to address their annual conference. This was an honor that had never been given to a member of a species so new to galactic society. Jake was nervous about speaking to thousands of the galaxy's most advanced beings, but he agreed to do it. The conference was held on a massive space station near the Galactic Center. Representatives from over 300 species attended. Jake stood on a stage in front of an audience that included beings he couldn't even begin to describe. Some floated in tanks of liquid. Others existed as pure energy fields. A few were so large they attended virtually through holographic projection. 3 months ago, Jake began, "I took a test that was supposed to be impossible for minds like mine. I solved it not because I'm particularly smart, but because I approached it differently than everyone expected." Jake had prepared a simple presentation using the same basic diagrams he had drawn during the test, explained his method step by step, showing how pattern recognition could bypass complex calculations. The lesson isn't that my way is better than your ways, Jake continued. The lesson is that there are many different ways to solve the same problem. Intelligence comes in many forms. After his presentation, Jake answered questions for 3 hours. Beings from across the galaxy wanted to understand how human minds worked. They were particularly interested in how humans could recognize patterns so quickly and intuitively. Dr. Vexhai, the eldest member of the Vorthok Mathematical Council, asked the final question. Professor Morrison, your method has forced us to reconsider the nature of intelligence itself.
Ow!
Do you think this will change galactic education? Jake thought carefully before answering. I hope it means that different kinds of minds will be valued equally. Just because someone can't do advanced calculations doesn't mean they can't contribute important insights. And just because someone is good at one type of thinking doesn't mean they're good at everything. The conference ended with a unanimous resolution to restructure galactic education. The old system that valued only computational power and advanced mathematics would be replaced with programs that recognize different types of intelligence. Over the next year, universities across the galaxy began incorporating human-style logic, puzzles into their curricula. The concept of cognitive diversity became a fundamental principle in galactic education. Species that had previously been considered intellectually inferior were given new opportunities to contribute their unique perspectives. Jake found himself at the center of this transformation, but he tried to stay humble about his role. Reporters asked how it felt to revolutionize galactic thinking. He usually said something like, I just treated a hard problem like a simple puzzle. Anyone could have done the same thing. The old universal cognitive assessment was retired and replaced with multiple tests that measured different types of problem-solving abilities. Some tests focused on computational power. Others measured pattern recognition. Still others evaluated creative thinking and intuitive reasoning. Jake was asked to help design the new pattern recognition assessments. He worked with educators from dozens of species to create tests that would be fair to different types of minds. It was some of the most satisfying work he had ever done. Back on Earth, Jake's success had made him famous, but he tried to keep his life as normal as possible. He still taught his undergraduate mathematics courses, still lived in his small apartment. He still did Sudoku puzzles every morning with his coffee. His students were initially intimidated by having a galactically famous professor, but they quickly realized that Jake was the same patient, encouraging teacher he had always been. If anything, his experience had made him more understanding of different learning styles. Professor Morrison, one of his students, asked after class, Do you ever wish you had solved a more important problem? Dude, Jake smiled. I think the most important thing I learned is that there are no unimportant problems. Every puzzle teaches us something about how minds work. Every question helps us understand the universe a little better. 1 year after the test, Jake received a final visit from examiner Keth. The Vorthok official had traveled to Earth specifically to thank Jake for his contribution to galactic knowledge. Your solution has changed everything, Examiner Keth said. We now understand that intelligence is not about having the most advanced cognitive abilities. It is about finding the right approach to each problem. I'm glad I could help, Jake said. But I still think anyone could have done what I did. The pattern was there all along. Just needed someone who was used to looking for patterns. Is exactly the point, Examiner Keth replied. Every species, every individual mind, has unique strengths. Your success has taught us to value those differences rather than trying to make everyone think the same way. After Examiner Keth left, Jake sat in his office and pulled out the morning newspaper. He turned to the Sudoku page and began working on the daily puzzle. It was a medium difficulty, nothing too challenging, as he filled in the numbers using the same logical methods that had solved the galaxy's most difficult problem. Jake reflected on how much his life had changed. He was still the same person, doing the same simple puzzles. But now the entire galaxy understood that simple solutions could be just as valuable as complex ones. The universe had learned that intelligence comes in many forms. And sometimes the most profound insights emerge from the most straightforward approaches. Jake had given the galaxy a new appreciation for the power of seeing patterns where others see only complexity, and for the truth that the best solutions are often hiding in plain sight.